Union Aerospace Corporation is the largest corporate entity in existence. Originally focused on weapon and defense contracts, new ventures have expanded into biological research, space exploration, and other scientific endeavors. With unlimited funds and the ability to engage in research outside of moral and legal obligations, the UAC controls the most advanced technology ever conceived.
In today's gaming landscape, we have unbelievable graphical fidelity and fluid animations that huge companies do on regular releases. Even indie developers have the opportunity to make something that looks just as good, if not better, like Ready or Not or Bright Memory. But in 2004, the best tech that money could buy could only be afforded by companies like Valve or id Software, and graphics and gameplay back in the days was as good as it could be, while still having a long journey ahead to improve on. 2004 in particular was one of the best gaming years I've experienced, and was also the same year that my favourite GTA game of all time came out too. But in the FPS scene, two giants clashed for the best looking game in the PC market, Valve and id Software. Around this period, they both began showcasing their new engines that bring technology in gaming forward, the Source engine and the id Tech 4 engine. As a result, they made two of the best looking shooters of their time, Doom 3 and Half-Life 2. These two shooters alone skyrocketed graphics and presentation to greater heights, and some credits are due to Halo 2 as well, showing what was possible on consoles at the time. Half-Life 2 would receive enormous acclaim, influencing not only generations of shooters, but just about every single shooter that Valve has ever made, going all the way up to Half-Life Alyx. Doom 3 was a big success, scoring high reviews across the board, but however, from the perspective of the Doom community, it was a very mixed bag. There were those who embraced the new changes that were made to Doom 3, and appreciated the bigger emphasis on taking things slower and getting immersed into the world. But a good number of other people felt that it detracted too much from the original Doom games, and was not the sequel they had wanted. Doom 3 is undoubtedly the black sheep of the franchise, because its complete overhaul of what Doom's gameplay was perceived as alienated a large portion of the Doom fanbase at the time. But I'm one of those people that absolutely loves the game, and this is a video I've been wanting to do for a very long time. 2 years prior to the original release of Doom 3, id Software showcased what is now known as the Alpha 2002 E3 demo. It showed a much more immersive and scarier atmosphere, and more destructible objects that the demons could use to surprise you. It was very rough, but at the same time was a glimpse of what the final product would become. Its reception was about the same. Fans were nervous in both ways, and id were taking the Doom franchise in a different direction. The demo is playable and can be downloaded off the internet. It's definitely worth trying out, because while it's very dated compared to the full release, it shows off other elements that were ultimately scrapped, which was a shame but also understandable because id with their new engine still had a number of technical issues to contend with. The Doom franchise up until this point never made a huge focus on creating a story-rich experience. When Doom first came out, the gameplay was the priority, as were most other titles in the FPS genre back in the 90s. It wasn't until Half-Life 1 and Halo 1 changed the name of the game, combining both polished gameplay and rich world building and storytelling. In 2004, many other shooters followed the same blueprint, and id Software wanted to be a part of that change. Doom 3 was the first effort in the series to have a narrative-driven Doom experience, creating a whole background story for the events to unfold, creating a gigantic facility that could be explored, especially in the first mission where everything seems normal. Take a look around and see the NPCs going about their business, trying to get their work done. For 2004, this was really well done and implemented at the time. And while nothing really happens here in the first mission, it does however present a number of conversations that foreshadow the events to come. When you tune into the NPC's conversations, you hear about rumours of quick transfers or bizarre injuries taking place. Now, since your character just arrived, you don't know what to think of it, but you as the player get the feeling that something's about to happen. The game also includes cutscenes, which is the first in the series, giving a cinematic outtake that helps tell the story of Doom 3. There were many in the community that did not like the direction Doom 3 took, and the emphasis on constructing a narrative was one of the reasons why. Personally, I liked it. I appreciated the efforts id took to making the Doom universe more alive and interactive, with the NPC conversations, the activation of machinery, or just simply pressing buttons and elevator buttons, and the atmospheric design of the UAC facility itself, as well as Hell. Story-wise, it's like the other two games. The UAC experiment with teleportation technology that goes horribly wrong.
Normal readings here. This is bad. Oh, God! I can't hold these levels. We're losing it! Help us! Unidentified shipment coming from all over the base.
But this time, the game develops the background story of that more, going as far as to say that the UAC's original intent was to terraform Mars, making it into a habitable colony. But when they dug underground and discovered ancient technology lost to time, they changed the directive of terraforming to experimentation with teleportation. The game also brings in a main villain, something the series never really had before, because in Doom, Hell itself was the antagonist, and the bosses you fight are just its minions. In Doom 3, Dr. Petruga is the scientist that puts in motion all the events that occur, and as you progress throughout the game, he taunts you constantly and echoes his laughter across the facility. Not a great deal is known about him, other than that he is a leading scientist in the corporation, but you can tell there's another force that's behind his actions, and it gets revealed later on exactly what happened to him in the first place. The story itself is decent. Its presentation lifts it up with the atmosphere and sheer detail of the UAC facility, and also has my favourite depiction of Hell in the whole series. You also learn more about the game's universe and characters through PDA entries and video logs, which adds even more background to the overall story, as well as enhancing the narrative. Speaking of which, your PDA will be a lifesaver, giving you important information as to locker codes and access to doors, and also information about your equipment. There's one more thing about the story and setting that most people don't talk about, and that's the feeling of total isolation. In the initial attack, the comm chatter is going apeshit, with Marines and other personnel asking for reinforcements or notifying anyone that's listening of their whereabouts. But after a while, you stop hearing it altogether, and you're pretty much on your own. And while you do come across certain individuals that have managed to evade the demons, you don't see them again, and by the end of the game, you're the only one left. You have little to no help here, but again, you're the Doom guy, the hornet's nest that Hell itself kicked and is paying the price. Speaking of the Doom guy, we're not playing as the one from Doom 1, 2 or 64. Doom 3 is basically its own self-contained universe, with its own adaptation of the original story, while still having most of the iconic demons and weapons. The reasoning for the Doom guy's presence is that he's a replacement that's been stationed in the Mars UAC facility. Like the original Doom guy, he's smack dab in the middle of a demonic invasion, and it's a fight for survival this time around, since the core of the game has changed to quite an extent. The fast and frantic gameplay is gone, replaced with a slower and methodical approach to battling Hell's forces. id Software at the time justified it as a case of wanting players to appreciate the visual spectacle that they have pumped into Doom 3, and since the id Tech 4 engine was a new one, id Software saw Doom 3 as an opportunity to wow fans into how amazing it looked. But as I said, a good number of fans were not happy with Doom being slower. But personally, I don't mind the more grounded, slower sense of movement. It gives you a certain level of vulnerability that makes it so that you can't run away, because the demons are stronger and faster than you, so you need to use the game's arsenal to fight back instead of running. In regards to the change, the only thing that's honestly changed is the speed. It still very much plays like the classics when you think about it. You collect ammo, armor shards and body armor, medkits, and you also find things that you can use to get access to other parts of each level. You still have pretty much the same weapons with 2 new additions. You go from room to room clearing demons. It's all there really. It's just slower, that's all. Nowadays we have both tight gameplay and great graphics, but in 2004, id Software made the visual presentation the priority here. Gameplay wise, it's actually great. The weapons have a weighty feel to them. The physics that associate with the interaction gives another layer of immersion that complements the gameplay and the setting. Movement and weapon animations are slower, but feel more realistic, which is something the Doom series has never really been known for. Like Doom 64, Doom 3 opts for more of a survival horror experience, whereas before, you felt like an empowered machine. In Doom 3, you feel like a human being just trying his best to stay alive. Demons will spawn out of nowhere, imps will set up ambushes to leap at you, Z-Sex will radio chatter amongst themselves once they're aware of your presence, zombies will also come out from the dark. And that's another thing to note, the dark. Most of the game you won't have much light to work with, and this was done on purpose, to make you more alert and potentially scared of what could happen if you go forward. You're given a flashlight to circumvent the dark areas of the game, but you're left vulnerable since you're unable to use a weapon. With the flickering lights, the creaking of steel, the whispers and wisps of demons and the maniacal laughter of Dr. Petruga, I found Doom 3 to be quite scary for its time. The game conditions you to this paranoid state, believing that you'll be attacked all the time, or that there's another demon around the corner. To be honest, you actually do get attacked all the time since it's a Doom game, but it's the way you approach the possibility in Doom 3 that's different. In the originals, you went in every room knowing you were going to be the last being that walks out. In Doom 3, you wonder if the next room will be the last one you ever walk in. Now, you actually can blitz through the levels like you would before, but as a first-time player, it wouldn't be surprising if you decided to take things slow, since that was what id Software intended for the first-time experience. With the character's movement, you have a greater deal of freedom this time around. You can crouch, jump, look horizontally and vertically and sprint for a pretty short amount of time. id Software decided that a stamina system would be implemented, which was designed to complement the survival horror aspect and not make players just speed their way through the experience. However, you can find an item called Adrenaline that gives you infinite sprint for a period of time. In Hell, you have infinite sprint for the whole level. Not sure why though. The pathfinding can sometimes be a bit quirky, getting stuck on small objects, the comparably weak physics that work like an on and off switch, and sometimes not being able to jump onto boxes. But in terms of controls, it works perfectly. It can be customized to your liking in the main menu. You also have a few power-ups such as Berserk, Adrenaline, Invisibility, and Invulnerability, but the latter are multiplayer only, and in single player, you don't come across the Berserk power-up often. But Adrenaline power-ups are frequent. Both power-ups are quite useful, especially when you have Berserk where you can just annihilate everything in the room in seconds. Doom 3 returns a number of iconic demons into its roster, reincarnating them with new designs, some of them being quite amazing. You have the Imps, Cacodemons, Hell Knights, Archviles, Lost Souls, Mancubis, they're all here save for the Arachnotron, which unfortunately didn't make it into the game, even though there was some concept art for it during its development. But you also have a good number of new members that are quite creepy and some just make my skin crawl hearing them. The Imp is as you'd expect. It moves slowly but can leap at incredible distances and throw fireballs. The zombies come in various forms but are slow and easy to outrun. Z-Sex and Commandos will be the biggest problems on the higher difficulties for their hit scans and incredible speed. Cacodemons are fast and hit fairly hard. Lost Souls are annoying and can be a pain to hit. Trites and Ticks are the enemies that make my skin crawl. Maggots are fast moving but are easily killable. Wraiths have a short teleportation that can close the distance, but that's about it. The Pinky has a brand new design that is way scarier than the original versions. Very fast and ill-advised to fight up close. Revenants also make a comeback, and I really like their design here, especially with their transparent skin that they have going for them. Cherubs are baby demons that are quick to get rid of, but can close the distance very quickly. The Mancubi or Mancubus are large and tank a lot of damage, but its fireballs are easy to dodge. Just don't get in the way, that's all. The Hell Knight probably has my favourite monster design in the whole game. It's absolutely menacing, and I'm thankful that it can't run. It hits like a truck, and it takes a lot of damage before it can finally be put down. It has a number of melee attacks as well as throwing plasma balls that do a shitload of damage. Again, use either the rocket launcher or the BFG, or a few shotguns up close, and it will go down quickly. The Vagary is a spider-like enemy that can use telekinesis to throw objects at you. Its attacks are pretty damaging, but with heavy weaponry, you can take it down, just like the Hell Knights. And finally, the Archvile. It works the same as before. It spawns weaker enemies, but instead of using that annoying attack from Doom 2, it just throws a wave at you, which is easier to deal with. The game has boss fights as well as one particular big baddie that I won't spoil. Doom 3's monster designs across the board are fantastic, and it fits the survival horror aspect of Doom 3's gameplay. Now with the forces of hell stacked up against you, what can you do to stop them? Well, use the arsenal of weapons, of course. If you've come off the classic Doom titles, then they've all made a return here. You have the pistol, shotgun, chain gun, rocket launcher, plasma rifle, BFG, chainsaw and fists, along with a few new additions. The shittest hand grenades ever made, the machine gun and finally the soul cube, an object that kills any enemy in one hit and gives you a fair amount of health back, which will be a lifesaver on the nightmare difficulty. The pistol is pretty much useless after the first 2 levels. The shotgun is very contested amongst the community. In the classics, you could kill enemies at just about any range, in other words, you could snipe them with it. But in Doom 3, that range benefit is now gone, and you have to get up close for any effect, and even then it won't always kill them in one hit unless you hit them directly. I do wish it was a bit more effective further away, but it's a weapon I still use often because when it comes down to it, it's still a badass weapon. The machine gun is the pistol on steroids. It shreds zombies in C-Sec and can be effective against Lost Souls and other annoying enemies like maggots. The chain gun is quite powerful. Even with 60 rounds per belt, you can put down many enemy types before having to reload. It can, however, be inaccurate sometimes, but it's still a good weapon anyway. The flashlight is technically a weapon too, since you can melee with it, but most of the time you will be using it for light and nothing more. The chainsaw is a thing of beauty. Most enemies get deleted with this thing, but bigger enemies I would advise not using it against, because you can still take damage from them. Hand grenades are effective when they actually hit their targets, but most of the time it'll be bouncing everywhere, that more often than not you'll miss, and most of the time it'll actually hit you instead. The plasma rifle is projectile based, but packs a punch and fires at a slower rate this time around. The rocket launcher is great for crowd control, but since most enemies close the distance and most levels are tight in space, you won't be using it much unless you're in a bigger area. The BFG, to be honest, kinda sucks. It has a charge function that determines its effectiveness, and even then, you need to actually hit the enemy for there to be much of an effect. On some occasions, it does wipe out a good number of demons, but I barely used it for the most part unless I needed to clear a room of Hell Knights or quickly dispatch an Archvile, which by the way, is easily taken care of with a chainsaw as soon as it spawns. Fists are fists. Not really effective against anything unless you have the Berserk power-up. And finally, the Soul Cube. You get this item at a certain point in the game, but the gist is this. It can only be used after killing 5 demons. Afterwards you get a prompt from the cube saying use us, which you do. It then kills whoever you've pointed it towards. The weapon lineup is great. They all have a sleek and consistent design that follows up with the environment and surroundings of Doom 3. My personal favourites are the shotgun, machine gun and the chainsaw. Doom 3's difficulties are a bit more comprehensible this time around. The names themselves give more clarity as to which one's the easiest and hardest. Of course, it brings back the nightmare difficulty, but don't worry, it's not like the originals where enemies respawn every 20 seconds. Instead, you lose health up until you have about 25 points of health. Basically, you have to keep moving and not get hit, which is easier said than done. You will constantly be on low health, which is bad enough because enemies do twice the damage and will generally just kill you in one hit, which makes enemies like the chain gun commandos and Z-Sec soldiers a priority here. But the good news is that you have the Soul Cube from the get-go, meaning that you can use it during critical fights. Personally, I'd recommend working your way up to veteran and that's it, but if you want an extra challenge, the Nightmare will give you a run for your money. Doom 3's sound design works differently than before. Every step of the way you are put into this position where anything could happen at any time. The sound of demons spawning, the bashing of pipes, lights flickering or just exploding. The overall soundscapes continuously make you uncomfortable, even when you're fully prepped to take on whatever comes at you. The weapons in general leave a lot to be desired. The plasma rifle and the BFG sound great. The chainsaw is loud and abrasive as it should be. Everything else though, not as good. The monster sounds are terrifying and are implemented really well here. Your hair will go up when you start hearing the sound of trites or ticks, which are the spider enemies with heads. And this game does have some terrifying moments, like the part where you're trapped in a room with 2 zombies with a chainsaw. When I experienced that the first time as a kid, I didn't touch the game for a very long time until I got older. In terms of graphics, it's getting to that point where it's not aged very well, but there are still aspects of the game's presentation that still hold out, more specifically the game's implementation of shadow and lighting. It's very dynamic and gives off this premise that not only is the place falling apart, but it's also getting harder to see. Also, the game's mixture of organic growth and futuristic architecture meshes well with one another. Towards the end, the facility becomes more like the hell you walked out of. Speaking of which, I love Doom 3's version of hell. It's hot, red, and full of medieval-inspired structures. It's also oppressive and uninviting as it should be. id Software pumped their blood, sweat, and tears into pushing their new engine to its absolute limits, and while there were a number of technical issues during its development, the final product came out as one of the best-looking shooters of its time. Great presentation, great implementation of shadow and lighting that complements the survival horror aspect of Doom 3, and great attention to detail in the weapons, the monsters, and the environmental design. Doom has always been known for offering one of the best single-player experiences in any shooter, and that hasn't changed even with the latest entries like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. But multiplayer, on the other hand, not so much. I've never really played the multiplayer in Doom 3, and to be honest with you, I never will. There are way better options out there in the multiplayer department, and when it came to id Software's approach to multiplayer, Quake was the series to go to for that, and not Doom. But that's not to say that people didn't play it. In fact, you could find a small but dedicated community that still play Doom 3's multiplayer to this day. From what I've read into, it's standard fare, with early 2000s deathmatch gameplay featuring power-ups and weapons to collect. Your characters portray the Marines that you can change colours with, and not unlike the way you change Doomguy's appearance in the classics. Initially it had 4 players only, then it was bumped to 8, and modders boosted that number. But even then, the multiplayer in general is not really something you would miss out on, because even in the year of its release, there were much better multiplayer games like Halo 2, Counter-Strike Source, Unreal Tournament 2004, and Quake 3 Arena. But if you're curious enough to check it out, then see if you can find some people in the Doom World community to play with. The modding community of Doom is massive, and while a lot of it is based off of the classic Doom titles that have the most mods, Doom 3 has a fair share of mods and total conversions that it has to offer. The majority of Doom 3's mod collection is a mixture of gameplay and graphical overhauls. I have mixed feelings about them personally, since I was already happy with Doom 3's gameplay, but better graphics are always appreciated. But mods like Doom 3 Phobos and Classic Doom 3 are where it's at, and shows just how much modding is possible within the game. While it's not as flexible as Doom 2, it's certainly more so than the recent entries which could really use a more open modding platform. The only issue here is that as much as you can mod Doom 3, the core gameplay can't be changed as much to fit the Doom 2 experience. Doom 3 was meant to be a slower paced game, and even with the painstaking level of tweaking, it's still going to feel slower in comparison. As for Doom 3 itself, I'd suggest playing it vanilla first, then get into the modding realm. You'll appreciate the changes so much more if you do it that way. A year after Doom 3, an expansion pack was made, developed by Nerve Software and published by id Software. The story takes place 2 years after the events of the main game, where the Hell invasion was stopped by the Doom guy. The UAC reopened the facility and continued their exploration of the ancient tech discovered. One Marine came across an object that sends shockwaves throughout the whole facility, once again opening the doors to Hell, and the Wheel of Time begins its hellish turn. This time you don't play as the Doom guy, but another Marine who's just called the Marine, a combat engineer who picked up the artifact, and is now having to face the forces of Hell himself. You also come across Dr. Petrugo once again, and he sends 3 powerful demons after you, wanting the artifact that you took. The expansion has a smaller cast of characters this time around, with Dr. Elizabeth McNeil guiding your way throughout the game. Resurrection of Evil doesn't change the core gameplay, but it does add some new weapons and enemies into the mix. For starters, you have the Grabber, which you can get in the first level. It lets you grab enemy projectiles and small enemies like Trites, Ticks, Cherubs, and Forgotten that replace the Lost Souls. You can also grab other objects as well as picking up items. It's a really useful weapon and can be great for saving ammo when you're low. The iconic Super Shotgun makes a return in 3D form, and it's much more powerful than the regular shotgun, making Revenants and other higher tier enemies easier to deal with. It does, however, have a slow reload time, and you can't switch weapons once the reload animation begins. Then there's the artifact. This time you don't have the Soul Cube, but the artifact is arguably a much better weapon once it's fully upgraded. The 3 hunters have a power that you absorb from them. The first one is slow-mo, the second is berserk, and the third is invincibility. The artifact has 3 charges that can only be replenished by getting up close to corpses. You'll notice an aura surrounding them, which is where the artifact comes in. But it's not a thing you can use too often, especially on Nightmare, where corpses are rare, and you have to save the charges for more difficult fights. All in all, the expansion's new weapons are amazing, and add more utility to the already polished gameplay. Most of the enemies from the main game make a return, along with a few new faces. You have the Forgotten, that are basically lost souls. Their design is reminiscent of the lost souls you fight in the classic Doom games, but honestly they're really trivial here, especially when you get your hands on the grabber, where you could just grab them and they die instantly. The Vulgar replaced the Imps basically. In Doom 3, Imps were the most common enemy. This time around you don't fight them much at all. The Vulgar are like Imps on steroids. They have more health, their fireballs do slightly more damage, and they have the most bullshit leap attack I've ever seen. It's so sudden and quick that it's impossible to anticipate it. The most effective means of taking them out is either with the grabber or the super shotgun. The bruiser has a really cool design to it. I find its TV-like mouth to be really unsettling, but it's a really annoying enemy to fight. Its projectiles are really fast and hit hard, and it doesn't seem to have a wind-up animation whatsoever. It just immediately fires at you. Usually I just use the artifact to get it out of the way, but if I'm out of charges, I just take pot shots until it's gone. Then you have the hunters themselves as well as the final boss. They each have their own puzzles to work around, but with the artifact, they're a lot easier to fight. The expansion has some great new weapons to play with and some interesting monsters to fight, but overall it's just a weaker experience compared to the main game. You can pick it up alongside the original Doom 3 or with the BFG edition. It's definitely worth a playthrough, especially if you want more Doom 3. In 2012, Doom 3 was re-released as the BFG edition, getting a PC port as well as console ports. It came packaged with Doom 1 up to Doom 3, alongside its expansion pack. It also came with a new DLC called The Lost Mission. The premise is that you're the last remaining Bravo squad member, the same squad that the Doom guy in the main game tried to reach. Barely escaping death, you find yourself between a pistol and a wraith, and naturally you begin fighting your way out. The Lost Mission is super short, much shorter than Resurrection of Evil. In fact, you could beat this in one sitting if you wanted to. The story is that while we came to know of 2 portals that lead to Hell, there was a third one that was being made, built to teleport large objects. Of course, you end up with the task to close it for good. You meet one other character who guides you as to where to go. Other than that, that's all there is. The Lost Mission is very bare bones, with not much of a story going for it. It removes some of the enemies from Resurrection of Evil, like the Vulgar and the Bruiser, and keeps everything else intact. You don't get the artifact at all, and you don't get the Soul Cube, unless you're playing on Nightmare where you can use the Soul Cube. Good thing though is that it does bring back the Super Shotgun and the Grabber, which were the 2 best weapons in the expansion pack. There really isn't much more to say on the Lost Mission. It's basically just more Doom 3 content, and even then it's not that impressive. I've played fan-made map packs that were way better than this. But since it's packaged with the BFG edition, it's worth a playthrough still if you've got time. Doom 3 is one of those games that both wowed and polarized the gaming community at the same time. It wasn't exactly what fans were expecting, and to some extent, it wasn't exactly what they wanted. But I appreciated that id Software were willing to try different things with the game's universe and tell a more fleshed out story. The gameplay is something that you will either enjoy or you will hate, since it doesn't play in the same way as the classic Doom games, at least in terms of speed anyway. But personally, I absolutely love Doom 3. It's one of my favourite horror games as well as being one of my favourite shooters of all time. Would I say that this is the best one in the series? Absolutely not. But is it worth getting? Absolutely yes. You have solid gameplay, a great atmosphere and setting, graphics that hold up well in specific departments, and a great roster of demons and weapons to play with. As to which version to get, personally I'd go with the original versions, but as for newcomers, I'd recommend the BFG edition, since it's better optimized for modern PCs and consoles. Plus, you get both classic Doom games and 2 expansion packs, or if you want to call them DLCs for Doom 3. But you could also get both, since they're really cheap nowadays, and even cheaper when on sale. Doom 3 is the black sheep of the series, but it is in no way a bad game whatsoever, contrary to what some hardcore Doom fans will tell you. But what I would advise is that you go into it knowing that it's going to be different from the older entries, and that id Software at the time wanted to try new things that took the series in a different direction, for better or worse. And while Doom 2016 and Eternal have brought the best of both worlds, combining both fantastic gameplay and great world building and storytelling, Doom 3 was a product of a time where shooters were being directed into being more of a story-driven experience, rather than just solely focusing on the gameplay and nothing more. Doom 3 is a fantastic shooter, and it's a game that I will never forget, and something that's important to my childhood. Thank you for watching.